She pushed a mop down the marble halls of a university where geniuses were born, but no one looked her in the eye. They walked past her like she was invisible, just another gray uniform in the background. But what no one knew, not the smug young professor, not the whispering students, not even the department head, was that the quiet old janitor had once solved equations that terrified Cold War mathematicians. And when $1 million riddle appeared on the board, it wasn't the scholars who cracked it, it was her. But to do it, she had to step out of the shadows and into a spotlight built to humiliate her. This isn't just a story about math. It's about second chances, buried brilliance, and the moment the world was forced to listen to the woman they tried to forget. The floor waxer hummed low beneath the golden chandeliers of the mathematics wing, echoing down the marble corridors like a memory stuck in time. Maggie Hale, 62 years old and stiff in the knees, moved slowly but with precision, her mop gliding in even arcs the way she once used to balance differential equations. Only now, nobody noticed her rhythm. Her gray maintenance uniform was faded at the seams, her hands weathered like cracked parchment, and yet, behind her glasses, her eyes still sparkled with sharpness the world had long since overlooked. Professors strode past without a nod. Students scrolled their phones while she cleaned around them. The only sign of her mind at work was a dog-eared notebook tucked into her back pocket, where pages were crammed with equations scribbled during smoke breaks behind the dumpsters. Most days she ate lunch alone, tucked in a service closet beneath the stairs, where she'd lean against paint cans and solve math puzzles by hand. The kind she'd read about back in 1976 before her brother shipped off to Vietnam and never came back, and life shoved her into survival mode. She once had a scholarship to study mathematics under Dr. Victor Zaldovich, the Cold War-era immigrant whose name still echoed in textbooks. But after her parents died in a car accident and she became guardian to her younger siblings, college evaporated like steam from a cracked kettle. That scholarship, that dream, gone. For decades, Maggie watched the world race ahead while she raised a family, buried loved ones, and worked every job imaginable to keep the lights on. And now, here she was, pushing a mop to the same halls where kids half her age talked about ideas she used to whisper in her sleep. They didn't see her, but that didn't mean she'd stopped thinking. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Dr. Elias Thorne, the newly anointed mathematics prodigy with perfect hair and zero humility, wheeled in a cart covered with velvet and unveiled his little stunt. Something he called the widow's riddle, a legendary equation, rumored to originate from post-Soviet research circles, one that had remained unsolved for over 40 years, stumping doctoral candidates, prize-winning scholars, and entire think tanks. With theatrical flair, he scrawled it across the chalkboard in thick white lines and turned his undergrads like a game show host daring contestants to spin the wheel. Solve this, and you win $10,000 in research funds, he announced, his voice slick as engine oil. Students leaned in, taking pictures with their phones, some laughing, others whispering doubts. Nobody was biting. Too complex, one muttered. Looks like it's just bait, said another. And then Maggie walked past with a cart of trash bags, slowed for a moment, and stared at the board like she was staring at a ghost. Her breath caught in her throat. That equation. She'd seen the first draft of it when she was 18, penciled into the margin of Zaldovich's notebook in a study group session she was never supposed to attend. He called it a door to another dimension of understanding, but never finished it. And now here it was, splashed across a whiteboard like some party trick. Maggie's eyes narrowed. She'd never solved it, not fully, but she'd tried. She tried on the night her daughter was born, when she went into labor, while calculating the third-tier inversion. She tried the day after she buried her husband. It haunted her like unfinished music. Standing there with a trash cart and aching knees, she wanted to laugh. Not because the equation was funny, but because she realized something. After all this time, it still mattered to her, more than anything. So she stared at it until one of the grad students glanced away and muttered, "Lost, lady." Maggie blinked, smiled gently, and walked on. But that image, it burned into her brain like lightning. A chalkboard, an old equation, and a second chance. The night janitor had called in sick, which meant Maggie drew double duty. It was after 11 p.m., and the hall was as still as a chapel. The only sound was the occasional squeak of her cleaning cart's wheels and the distant rumble of a vending machine spitting out stale snacks. As she approached Lecture Hall 2B, her eyes caught that same damn chalkboard again. Dr. Thorne had left it up like a trophy. She stepped inside, alone, drawn to it like a moth to flame. And there, under dim lights, she stood again before the widow's riddle. She didn't know her hands were moving until she found herself correcting the coefficient on the third line. She was muttering to herself about function collapses when the door creaked open. Trying to solve that? You'd be the fifth this week, came a voice, sharp and amused. Dr. Thorne stood there in tailored slacks, arms crossed. He was holding a coffee cup he had no intention of finishing. Maggie didn't flinch. "Just looking," she said, calmly wiping chalk dust from her hands. "You planning to dust off a solution?" He smirked, motioning to the mop in the corner. She glanced at the equation, then back at him, just revisiting an old friend. He tilted his head, amused, like someone watching a dog pretend to talk. "Do let me know if your friend ever gives up its secrets." He turned and left before she could answer. Maggie watched him go, heart pounding, not from fear, but fury. She was used to being dismissed, but something about the smugness in his tone snapped something loose. That night, she skipped dinner, turned off her TV, and pulled out her old notes from 1981, smudged, yellowed pages she kept locked in a box marked taxes that no one ever bothered to check. The math world had moved on, but the laws of logic hadn't. Somewhere in those notes was the first half of the answer, and this time, she wasn't going to let it go. Her one-bedroom apartment above the laundromat still smelled like Tide and mildew. Maggie set down her keys, lit the single lamp on her desk, and unfolded the past like it was a map back to herself. The notebook was a battlefield, ink-stained pages filled with frantic scribbles, desperate proofs, questions she'd never had the training or time to answer. Her cat, Newton, curled up beside her, indifferent to the storm gathering in her brain. Maggie picked up a pencil, cracked her knuckles, and began to work. Line by line, the widow's reel began to unravel. Not because the world had changed, but because she had. She'd spent a lifetime learning practical math. Tax returns, payroll balancing, utility bills stretched thin across pay periods. But now, all that arithmetic met theoretical elegance like old friends reunited. It wasn't perfect. Not yet. But she saw it. There was a hole in Thorne's logic, a subtle inefficiency. Something fixable. It was past 2 a.m. when she leaned back, surrounded by paper scraps and formulas, her eyes burning with exhaustion and excitement. For the first time in 40 years, she wasn't just cleaning up after someone else's brilliance. She was chasing her own. She made herself a cup of instant coffee, stared out the window at the neon glow of the laundromat sign, and whispered to no one, "I'm not done yet." By the following Thursday, whispers had started, not in the faculty lounge, not yet, but in the student lounge, among the overlooked, the underdogs, the ones who noticed things professors didn't. Javier Morales, a second-year grad student from El Paso, was the kind of guy who stayed late after class, always hungry for more, always curious. He was walking past the empty lecture hall when he noticed something odd. The chalkboard had changed. The equation looked adjusted, cleaner, sharper. He stepped inside and saw Maggie, eraser in one hand, chalk in the other, like she'd been caught writing secrets in a stranger's diary. "Did you just fix that?" he asked, stunned. Maggie looked at him, embarrassed. "I wasn't trying to, just cleaning." But Javier had taken a picture of the board 2 days ago and pulled it up on his phone. The change was subtle but brilliant. "Wait, that substitution, you did that?" Maggie wiped her hands. It made more sense that way. Javier stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. "Who are you?" She gave a tight-lipped smile. Just someone who never forgot what she used to love. The next day, Javier mentioned it to a friend, who told another. Within 48 hours, half the math department had heard rumors about the janitor who tweaked Thorne's challenge. Some dismissed it. Others were intrigued. But one person took it as a personal insult, Dr. Elias Thorne. The moment he found out, he called a department-wide seminar and made a very pointed invitation. "Let's open the floor to anyone who thinks they have insight to offer," he said with a smirk. "Even our beloved custodial staff." The trap was set, but Maggie wasn't afraid. She'd already solved bigger problems than him. It wasn't just the students talking now. By Monday morning, whispers had crept into the corners of the faculty lounge like cold air under a poorly sealed door. Most professors scoffed. Of course, what would a janitor know about multivariable theory? But a few, the quieter ones, the older ones who remembered when intuition used to matter more than titles, were listening. And then it happened. Javier, eager but naive, made the mistake of casually telling Dr. Thorne what he saw. Maggie Hale? She corrected the symmetry in line 3. I think it works. Thorne froze mid-coffee sip. The janitor? You're telling me the woman who polishes my podium just rewrote Soviet-era mathematics. The laugh he let out could have cracked ice. That's adorable. But Maggie was in the corner, wiping a counter no one had touched in a week, and she heard every word. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the restraint of not saying what burned in her chest. She looked up, locked eyes with Thorne for a split second, and said nothing, because she didn't have to. The moment passed, but the tension didn't. That night, Maggie sat down at her desk, flipped to a clean page, and rewrote the solution. This time, not with hesitation, not in pencil, but in ink. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was documenting it. And whether they accepted it or not, that board was going to see her name next to a solved riddle by week's end. She'd been polite long enough. There's a certain tone that whispers take on when they're about to break into roars. And by Wednesday, that tone was everywhere. A few graduate students peeked at Maggie's notebook, now carried in her uniform vest, and gasped quietly at what they saw. Equations layered with intuitive analogies and shortcuts no textbook had ever shown them. Javier started slipping copies of her proofs to his study group, and within days, students were testing her logic during office hours, without telling professors whose names were on the door. A debate started in hushed corners. Was it real? Could it be plagiarism? But there was no source to plagiarize from. Maggie's solutions were original, efficient, and unnervingly elegant. Word got back to Dr. Patel, an old-school mathematician who valued method over ego. He quietly asked for a copy, read it over lunch, and didn't touch his sandwich once. That afternoon, during a faculty meeting, Thorne's posture was stiff, his eyes twitching at every mention of Maggie or the janitor or that cleaned-up proof. So he did what threatened men do. He plotted a spectacle. Let's hold a public session, he suggested. A little open-floor seminar. Give the students a real learning experience. Maybe we'll get a laugh out of it. The bait was obvious to anyone who paid attention. But when Maggie was formally invited, she didn't blink. I'll be there, she said, wiping chalk dust from her palm. Her voice was calm, but her spine? Steel. Friday afternoon, the math department seminar room was packed beyond capacity. Students leaned against walls. Faculty took the front row, and the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that usually comes before a public execution or miracle. Dr. Thorne stood at the podium in a charcoal gray suit, grinning like a game show host who already knew the contestant didn't have the answer. Today, he began, we invite anyone, regardless of credentials, to tackle the widow's riddle. His eyes flicked to Maggie, who stood quietly at the side of the room in her uniform. Notebook under her arm, glasses freshly cleaned. Maggie Hale has graciously accepted the invitation. The way he said her name, it was like he was daring her to speak out loud. Some students chuckled nervously. Others just watched. The room wasn't cruel. It was curious. Maggie stepped forward, slow and steady, as if she were walking into a burning building she'd already mapped out in her mind. No flash, no theatrics, just calm, deliberate motion. She took the chalk. The board towered over her like a mountain. And then she began, not with a final solution, not with flash, but with the old equation itself, explaining each line, each assumption, with the quiet authority of someone who'd lived within her bones for half a lifetime. One student leaned in and whispered, "She's teaching it." Another nodded, "Better than Thorne ever did." The minutes stretched like hours as Maggie rewrote the foundation of the riddle. Not to show off, but to guide the room down the same path she'd walked for decades in silence. Her voice was soft, but her logic was thunder. Every simplification she offered, every substitution she applied, made heads tilt, Eyes widened. Even the math professors in the front row began flipping pages in their own notes. Dr. Patel, normally stone-faced, scratched his head in awe. "She's reframing the interaction between the nested functions," he muttered, half to himself. But Dr. Thorne couldn't stay quiet. "You've skipped steps," he said loudly, interrupting her mid-proof. Maggie looked up and replied with the kind of controlled grace that takes years of being talked down to. "I haven't skipped them. I've eliminated them by replacing the dependency entirely." Her chalk moved again. She outlined a solution that took what once needed 13 steps and condensed it to 7, with no loss of integrity. You could feel the shift in the room. Doubt turned to silence. Silence turned to awe. One grad student in the back whispered, "Holy hell, she's right." When she circled the final answer, the chalkboard glowed like a monument, and Maggie didn't smile. She just turned, hands chalk dusted, and said quietly, "It's not perfect, but it works." The applause didn't come immediately, not because it wasn't deserved, but because no one had quite processed what they just witnessed. The stunned silence cracked when Dr. Patel stood up and clapped once, slow but solid. Then others followed. Some students cheered. One whistled, and then, like floodgates opening, the room burst into applause. Except for one man. Dr. Thorne sat frozen, lips parted, eyes narrowed. He stood slowly and approached the board, eyes scanning each line like a man searching for a flaw in his own DNA. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, not sarcastic now, just rattled. Maggie looked at him and replied, "From Zaldovich. 40 years ago. I was his assistant." A hush fell again. The name carried weight. Zaldovich was legend, whispered like myth. "You were that Maggie?" a professor asked, stunned. She nodded, and then it all clicked. The missing student from the 1980 Cold War program. The unpublished work. The notes that never made it to journals. Why are you here?" Thorne asked, truly bewildered now. "You should be at Princeton. Or lecturing in Moscow." Maggie smiled. Not bitter, just tired. "Because life isn't linear," she said. "Because not everyone gets to take the straight road. And because my job isn't who I am, it's just what I did to survive." Her voice cracked slightly. "I wanted to finish what I started. And I didn't want to die knowing I never tried." One student quietly wiped their eyes. Another clutched a notebook like it was a lifeline. Maggie gathered her things, nodded respectfully to the room, and left, not triumphant, not cocky, just whole. And behind her, Thorne looked at the board like it had personally betrayed him, because it had. By Monday morning, Maggie Hale was no longer just a name on a maintenance schedule. She was a name on everyone's lips, from curious undergrads to stunned faculty. People dug through the archives. Someone found a faded group photo from a 1979 summer program. There she was, 18 years old, standing beside a young Zaldovich, holding a chalkboard marker like she was born with it. Another professor confirmed the rumor. Maggie was supposed to be one of the youngest research fellows in the Cold War-era math think tank, back when America raced to stay ahead in nuclear theory. But then, nothing. She vanished from the field. No degree. No publications. Just a name that disappeared like chalk in the rain. That is, until now. When asked about it in a hallway interview, Maggie simply said, "I had to step away. My family needed me. Life didn't leave room for math." There was no anger in her voice, just realism. But numbers don't care how old you are. They'll wait for you to come back. That quote made it onto bulletin boards. One student pinned it above his desk. Another sent it to her mom. And suddenly, Maggie wasn't just a woman with a solution. She was a symbol for second chances, a beacon for every soul who'd ever thought it was too late to go back and try again. The university board met an urgent session that same week, crowded around a long mahogany table, as the provost asked a question no one wanted to say aloud. What do we do with this? Some pushed to celebrate Maggie openly. Others warned it would make the department look foolish for having ignored her. But one voice cut through the noise. Dr. Patel, calm and unwavering. The real question is, do we value the truth or the titles? Silence followed. He continued. We spent years teaching kids how to recognize genius. And one just showed up in uniform with a mop. If we ignore her, we're not just blind. We're frauds. That ended the debate. Maggie was called in for a formal meeting. When she sat down, nervous, still in her janitor's clothes, the dean leaned forward and said, "We'd like to offer you a co-lecturing role, starting next semester." She blinked, stunned. "Teaching?" "Yes." "Can I still clean?" They stared at her. "I do my best thinking when I'm mopping floors." The room chuckled awkwardly, but no one argued. The next day, they posted a formal notice. Margaret Hale, adjunct lecturer in applied theoretical mathematics. A few students took selfies with it. Others just stared, silently inspired. By mid-semester, Maggie's desk in the front row had a fresh apple on it every morning. Sometimes, too, students who once snickered when she passed by now sat beside her, notebooks open, eager to learn. She wasn't flashy. She didn't command the room with booming lectures. But when she explained a problem, it felt like sitting with your mother at the kitchen table while she taught you bake from scratch. Slow, patient, and full of hidden wisdom. She started holding quiet evening study groups in the old library annex. Word spread fast. Soon, veterans, night students, single moms, and older adults began attending too. People who'd always felt out of place in a university filled with kids in sweatpants and AirPods. Maggie welcomed them all. "There's no wrong age to remember who you used to be," she said one night, while explaining logarithmic decay to a group of 40-somethings who hadn't done algebra in decades. Dr. Patel visited once and sat silently in the back, smiling. He later told the dean, "She's building more mathematicians in 2 evenings a week than some of us do all year." When Maggie walked across campus now, people nodded, smiled, held doors. And while she still wore her old uniform, she carried something different, recognition, not for the job she did, but for the mind she never stopped nurturing. It took another month, but eventually, Dr. Thorne approached her. It was after faculty lunch, in the side garden where the math building met the old oak trees. He didn't look smug this time, just uncomfortable. He had a manila folder under one arm and 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "I thought you might like cream," he said, holding one out. She took it, suspicious but polite. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he sighed. "I underestimated you." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "You didn't just underestimate me. You tried to humiliate me." He nodded slowly. "Fair. I did." There was something new in his voice. Wait, humility. Something scraped raw. "I've started rereading your old notes, the ones Javier scanned. There's a method in your recursion layering I haven't seen before. I don't think it's in any of the standard literature." Maggie took a sip of the coffee. "Because I didn't write it for publication. I wrote it to understand things I didn't have words for yet." Thorne looked at her. "That's the kind of math that changes things." A long pause followed. Then he pulled out the folder and handed her the latest draft of his research. "I scribbled some notes. Page 11. There's something I can't resolve. Thought maybe you could look." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "I'll take a look," she said. No promises. It was an apology with flowers and trumpets. But for him, it was as close as the man could come. And for Maggie, that was enough. 6 months later, the lecture hall was packed to the rafters. The university had organized a special event, Legacy in Numbers, rediscovering the hidden geniuses of mathematics. On the bill was one name that made jaws drop, Maggie Hale. Students, faculty, and even visiting scholars flew in. Dr. Thorne introduced her, not with pomp, but with respect. "Tonight," he said, "we hear from someone whose work predates some of ours, whose mind rivals the best in the field, and whose perseverance, well, it makes the rest of us look like we took shortcuts." When Maggie stepped onto that stage, she wore no makeup, no blazer, no airs. Just her pressed uniform, a whiteboard marker, and the steady gait of someone who'd walked through fire and come out knowing exactly who she was. Her presentation? Simple, brilliant, accessible, and utterly unforgettable. She ended with a story, not about math, but about Miss Chance's rediscovery and the quiet voice that whispers, "It's not too late." When the crowd stood for her, the applause wasn't just admiration, it was gratitude. Later that night, while she packed her materials. A young woman approached her, teary-eyed. "You remind me of my mom," she said. "She used to be brilliant, too." Maggie hugged her and whispered, "Then maybe it's time she remembered that." And somewhere in the back of the room, Dr. Thorne watched, not with jealousy, but with awe, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the smartest person in the room, and he was perfectly okay with that.